Page 554. In 1949, the special camps were created, and then and there, on the basis of some summit decision, masses of women were driven from camps in the European North and the Transvolga area through the Sverdlovsk transit prison to Siberia, to Taishet, to Ozerlag. But in 1950, someone found it convenient to assemble all the women not in Ozerlag, but in Dubrovnik, in Temnikov, in Mordvinia. And so all those same women enjoying all the conveniences of Gulag travel were dragged through the same Sverdlovsk transit prison to the west. In 1951, these special camps were set up in Kamerava province, Kamishlag, and that turned out to be where the women's labor was required. And those ill-fated women were again put to the torment of being sent to the Kamerava camps through that same accursed Sverdlovsk transit prison. The time came for liberation, but not for all of them. All those women who were left to drag out their terms in the midst of the General Khrushchev relaxation were once again swung out to Siberia through the Sverdlovsk transit prison into Mordvinia. It was thought better to have them all together. Well, after all, we have our own self-contained economy. The isles are all our own, and the distances aren't so very great for a Russian. And the same sort of thing happened to individual deaths, the more unfortunate ones. Shendrik was a big, merry, open-faced fellow, and he labored honestly, as I say, in one of the Kubyshev camps, and had no imitation of the evil fate overtaking him. Had no intimation of the evil fate overtaking him. But this evil fate struck nonetheless. An urgent order arrived at the camp, not just from anybody, but from the Minister of Internal Affairs himself. And how could the minister know of Shendrik's existence? The order was to deliver this Shendrik to prison number 18 in Moscow immediately. They grabbed him, dragged him off to the Kubyshev transit prison, and from there to Moscow with no delay. But not to some prison number 18. Instead, with all the rest, he went to the widely known Krasnaya Prasnya prison. Shendrik didn't know about any prison number 18. No one had told him. But his misfortune did not dress. No more than 2 days had passed before they jerked him onto a prisoner transport again, and this time took him all the way to Peshora. The landscape outside the train window grew even sparser and grimmer. Shendrik was alarmed. He knew there was an order from the minister, and here they were rapidly hauling him off to the north, and that meant the minister had some awful evidence against him. In addition to all the other torments of the trip, they stole 3 days of bread rations from him while he was en route, and by the time he got to Peshora, he was staggering. Peshora greeted him inhospitably. They drove him out to work in the wet snow, hungry and unsettled. In 2 days, he never had a chance to dry out his shirts, nor even a chance to stuff his mattress with pine needles. And right then, they ordered him to turn everything that he had that was government issued. Turn in everything he had that was government issued. And once again, they scooped him up and whisked him still flat there for Kuta. It seemed quite evident from everything that had happened that the minister was determined to destroy Shendrik. And not him alone, but the entire group in in his prisoner transport. At Vorkuta, they didn't touch Shendrix for a whole month. He went out to general assignment work, even though he had not yet recovered from his travels. But he had begun to reconcile himself to his Arctic fate. And then suddenly one day they called him out of the mine and chased him breathless to the camp to turn in everything that was everything he had that was government issue. And in 1 hour's time he was being carried off to the south. Now by this time he had already begun to smell of personal vengeance. They took him to Moscow prison number 18. They held him in the cell there for 1 month. And then he was summoned to some lieutenant colonel who asked him, "Where the hell have you been? Are you really a mechanical engineer?" And Shendrix confessed that he was. And then they took him off to none other than, yes, the Paradise Islands. Yes, there are such islands in the archipelago. This coming and going of people, these destinies, and these stories greatly enlivened the transit prisons. And the old camp veterans advised newcomers, lie down and take it easy. They feed you the guaranteed minimum here. You don't have to tire your back. And when it's not crowded, you can sleep as much as you want to. So just stretch out and lie there from one handout of gruel to the next. The food is sparse, but the sleeping is good. Only those who know what general assignment work is in the camps will understand that a transit prison is a rest home, a happiness for our path, a happiness on our path. And one more advantage too, when you sleep in the daytime, the hours pass more quickly. If you can just kill off the day, the night will go away on its own. True, recalling that labor created the human being and that only labor can reform the criminal, and sometimes having auxiliary projects and sometimes acting with subcontractors in order to keep up their financial end. The bosses of the transit prison might sometimes even drive their local transit manpower out to labor. The work at that same cultist transit prison before the war was not the least bit easier than in a regular camp. In the course of a winter day, 6 or 7 sleeping prisoners were harnessed to a tractor sledge and had to drag it 7 miles along the Divina River to the mouth of the Visheta. They got stuck in the snow and fell down, and the sledges got stuck, and it would seem that any work more wearing and debilitating could hardly have been thought up. But it turned out that this wasn't the actual work, but merely the warm-up. There at the mouth of the Visheta, they had to load 13 cubic yards of firewood from the sledges, and the same people harnessed in the same way. The pain is no longer with us, and this is no subject for new artists. It is merely a crude reproduction from nature. Had to haul the sledges back to their transit prison home. Now, what does the camp have to offer after that? You wouldn't even survive to get there. The work brigade leader for the task was colored Pegas, and the workhorses were electrical engineer Dmitriev, quartermaster Corps Lieutenant Colonel Perezayev, and Vasily Vlasov, who is already familiar to us, but not all the other names can be collected at this date. During the war, the Artemis transit prison fed its prisoners peep tops, at the same time put them to work on a permanent basis. There were garment shops, foot gear felting shops, where woolen fibers were folded in hot water and acids. In the summer of 1945, we went out to the stiflingly stagnant cells of Krasnaya Presnya to work as volunteers, for the right to breathe the air the whole day long, for the right to sit unhurried and unhindered in a quiet plank latrine, an incentive that is often overlooked, heated by the August sun. And these were the days of Potsdam and Hiroshima, listening to the peaceful buzzing of a lonely bee, at last, for the right to get an extra quarter-pound of bread at night. They took us to the wharves of the Moscow River, where the timber was being unloaded. It was our job to roll the logs off some of the piles and carry them over and stack them in other piles. We spent a good deal more strength than we received in extra food in compensation. Nonetheless, we enjoyed going out to work there. I often have to blush at my recollections of my younger years. That's where my younger years were spent. But whatever casts you down also teaches you a lot. And it turned out that as a residue of the officers' shoulder boards, which had trembled and fluttered on my shoulders for 2 years and all, some kind of poisonous golden dust had settled in the empty space between my ribs. On that river wharf, which was a camplet too, there was also a compound with watchtowers surrounding it. We were merely transient, temporary work sloggers, and there had been no talk at all, no rumor, that we might be allowed to stay and serve out our terms there. But when they formed us up for the first time, and the work assignment foreman looked down the line to pick out temporary work brigade leaders, my worthless heart was bursting under my woolen field shirt. Me, pick me. I was not chosen, but why did I want it? I would only have made further shameful mistakes. Oh, how hard it is to part with power. This one has to understand. There was a time when Presnaya became the virtual capital of GULag, in the sense that no matter where you went, you couldn't bypass it. Just like Moscow. Just as when one travels in the Soviet Union, it is more convenient to proceed from Tashkent to Sochi and from Chernigov to Minsk by Moscow. They dragged the prisoners there from all over and sent them off all over by a Presnaya. And that's the way it was when I was there. Presnaya was at the point of breakdown from overcrowding. They built a supplementary building, only the 3 trains of cattle cars carrying those who had been sentenced right at counterintelligence bypassed Moscow on the Circle Line around it, which, as it happened, went right past Presnaya, perhaps even saluting it with a whistle on the way. But we do have a ticket when we come to Moscow as free passengers in transit, and we hope sooner or later to proceed in the desired direction. At Presnaya, at the end of the war, and just after, not only the prisoners who arrived there, but even the very highest ranking officials and even the heads of GULag itself were unable to predict who would proceed there. At that time, the prison system had not yet crystallized as it had by the 50s, and there were no routes and no destinations were indicated for anybody, except for perhaps for service instructions. Keep under strict guard, to be employed only on general assignment work. The convoy sergeants carried the bundles of prison cases, torn folders, tied somehow with twine or ersatz cotton string made of paper into a separate wooden building that housed the prison officers, and tossed them onto the shelves, on tables, under chairs, simply on the floor in the aisle, just as their subject prisoners lay in the cells. They became untied and got scattered and mixed up. One room, a second, and a third got filled up with those mixed-up cases. Secretaries from the prison office, well-fed, lazy, free women in bright-colored dresses, sweated in the heat, fanned themselves and flirted with prison and convoy officers. None of them wanted to or had the strength a way through that chaos. And yet the trainloads had to be dispatched in the red trains several times a week, and every day 100 people had to be sent out on trucks to nearby camps. A case of every zec had to be sent with him. So just who was going to work on all that long, drawn-out mess? Who was there to sort out the cases and select the prisoners for transports? It was entrusted to several work assignment supervisors from among the transit prison trustees, who were either bitches or half-breeds. They moved freely through the prison corridors, entered the prison office, and were the ones who decided whether your case would be put in a bad prisoner transport or whether they would really exert themselves, search long and hard, and put it in a good one. The newcomers were not mistaken in thinking that there were whole camps which were death camps, and they were right about that. But their idea that there were some that were good was simply a delusion. There were no good camps, but only certain easier duties within them, and they could only be sorted out on the spot. The fact that the prisoner's whole future depended on such another prisoner, with whom one ought perhaps to find the chance to talk, even if by the bath attendant, and whose hand ought perhaps to grease, even if by the storage room keeper, was worse than if his fortunes had simply been determined blind by the roll of the dice. The invisible and unrealized opportunity to go south to Noche instead of north to Maurice, in return for a leather jacket, to go to Serenbriani or outside Moscow instead of Taishet in Siberia, for a couple of pounds of fat bacon, and perhaps to lose both the leather jacket and the bacon fat for nothing at all. Only aggravated and fatigued, tired souls. Maybe someone did manage to arrange it. Maybe someone got himself fixed up that way. But most blessed of all were those who had nothing to give and who spared themselves all that anxiety. Submissiveness to fate, the total abdication of your own will in the shaping of your life, the recognition that it's impossible to guess the best and the worst ahead of time, but that it was easy to take a step you would reproach yourself for. All this freed the prisoner from any bondage, made him calmer, and even ennobled him. And thus it was that the prisoners lay in rows in the cells, and their fates lay in undistributed piles in the rooms of the prison office. And the assignment supervisors took the files from the particular corner where it was easiest to get them, and some zecs had to spend 2 or 3 months gasping at this accursed prisoner, while others would whiz through in the speed of a shooting star. As a result of all that congestion, haste, and disorder with the cases, sometimes sentences got switched at Presnia and at other transit prisons as well. This didn't affect the 58s because their prison terms, in Maxim Gorky's phrase, were terms with a capital letter. They were intended to be long, and even when they seemed to be nearing their end, we just never got there anyway. But it made sense for big thieves and murderers to switch with some stupid non-political offender, and so they and their accomplices would inch up to such an individual and question him with interest and concern, and he, not knowing that a short term at a transit prison isn't supposed to disclose anything about himself, would innocently tell them that his name was, for example, Vasily Yevashkin, and that he was born in 1913, and that he lived in Semiduvia, and had been born there, and that his term was 1 year, Article 109. Negligence. And then Yevgrashkin was asleep, or maybe not even asleep, and there was such a racket in the cell, and there was such a crowd at the swill trough in the door that he couldn't make his way there to listen. While on the other side of it, in the corridor, they were rapidly muttering a list of names for prison transport. Some of the names were shouted from the door into the cell, but not Yevgrashkin, because hardly had the name been read out in the corridor than Irka, the thief, had obsequiously, and it can be obsequious when it's necessary, shoved up its note and answered quickly and quietly, Vasily Parfenovich, born 1913, village of Stemodubia, 109, 1 year, and ran off to get his things. The real Yevgrashkin yawned, lay back on his bunk, and patiently waited to be called the next day, and the next week, and the next month. And then he made so bold as to bother the prison superintendent. Why hadn't he been taken in the prisoner transport? And every day in all the cells they kept calling out the name of some Zivyaga. And when a month later, or a half year later, they got around to combing through all the cases by calling the roll, what they had left was just one file belonging to Zivyaga, a multiple offender sentenced for a double murder, robbing a store, 10 years, and one shy prisoner who was trying to tell everybody that he was Yevgrashkin, although he couldn't make anything out from the photo, and so he damn well was Zivyaga, and he had to be tucked away in a penalty camp with GULag, because otherwise it would have been necessary to confess that the prisoner transport had made a mistake. And as for the other Yevgrashkin, who had been sent off on a prisoner transport, he wouldn't even be able to find where he had gone, because none of the lists were left. And anyway, he had only a 1-year term and had been sent to do farm work without being under guard, and got 3 days off his sentence for every day he worked. Or else he had simply run away, and was long since home, or more likely, was already imprisoned again on a new sentence. There were also eccentrics who sold their short terms for a kilo or 2 of fat bacon. They figured that any case authorities would check up and establish their correct identities, and sometimes they did. During the years when the prisoners' cases didn't carry any indication of their final destination, the prison transport, the transit prisons, turned into slave markets. Their most desired guests at the transit prisons were the buyers. The word was heard more and more often in the corridors and cells, and was used without any shadow of irony, just as it became intolerable everywhere in the industry simply to sit and wait until things were sent from the center on the basis of allocations, and it was more satisfactory to send one's own pushers and pullers to get things done. The same thing happened in GULag. The natives on the island kept dying off, and even though they cost not 1 ruble, a count was kept of them, and one had to worry about getting more of them for oneself, so there wouldn't be any failure in fulfilling the plan. The buyers had to be sharp, have good eyes, and look carefully to see what they were taking, so that the last laggards and the invalids didn't get shoved off on them. The buyers who picked a transport on the basis of case files were poor buyers. Conscientious merchants demanded that the merchandise be displayed alive and bare seen for them to inspect. And that was just what they used to say, without smiling. Merchandise. Well, what merchandise have you brought? Asked the buyer at the Butyrki station, observing and inspecting the female attributes of a 17-year-old Ira Kalina. Human nature, if it changes at all, changes not much faster than the geological face of the earth, and the very same sensations of curiosity, relish, and sizing up which slave traders felt of the slave girl markets 25 centuries ago, of course, possessed the Gulag bigwigs of the Usman prison in 1947, when they, a couple of dozen men in MVD uniform, sat at desks covered with sheets. This was for their self-importance, since it would have seemed awkward otherwise, and all the women prisoners were made to undress in the box next door, and to walk in front of them, barefoot and bare-skinned, turn around, and stop and answer questions. Drop your hands, they ordered, those who had adopted the defensive posture of closet sculpture. After all, these officers were very seriously selecting vendors for themselves and their colleagues. And so it was, before the new prisoner various manifestations foreshadowed the camp battle of the morrow, and cast their pall over the innocent spiritual joys of the transit prison. For just 2 nights, they put a special assignment prisoner in the cell in Krasnaya Presnya, and he was next to me in the bunk. He traveled about with special assignment orders, which meant that an invoice had been filled out in central administration, indicating that he was a construction technician and could be used only in that capacity in his new location, and this went with him from camp to camp. The special assignment prisoner was traveling in the common Stalopin cars and was kept in the common cells of the transit prison, but he wasn't nervous. He was protected by his personal document, and he wouldn't be driven out to fell timber. A cruel and determined expression was the principal trait of this veteran's face. He had already served out the greater part of his term, and I did not yet realize that this exact expression would in time etch itself on all our faces, because a cruel and determined expression is the national hallmark of the Gulag Islanders. People with soft, conciliatory expressions die out quickly on the islands. He observed our naive floundering with an ironic smile, just as people look at 2-week-old puppies. What should we expect in camp? Taking pity on us? He taught us. From your very first step in camp, everyone will try to deceive and plunder you. Trust no one but yourself. Look around quickly. Someone may be sneaking up on you to bite you. 8 years ago, I arrived in Archipelago, just as innocent and just as naive as you are now. They unloaded us from 2 trains. The convoy prepared to lead us the 6 miles to camp through the deep, crumbling snow. 3 sleds came up beside us. Some hefty chap whom the convoy didn't interfere with came over to us and said, "Brothers, put your things on the sleds and we will carry them there for you." We remember reading in books the prisoners' belongings were carried on carts, and we thought, it isn't going to be all that inhuman in camp. They are concerned about us. And we loaded our things on the sleds. They left, and we never saw them again, not even an empty wrapper. But how can that happen? Is there any law there? Don't ask idiotic questions. There is law there. The law of the taiga, of the jungle. But as for justice, there never has been any in Gulag, and there never will be. That Kargapal incident was simply a symbol of Gulag, and you have to get used to something else too. In the camp, no one ever does anything for nothing. No one ever does anything out of the generosity of his heart. You have to pay for everything. If someone proposes something to you that is unselfish, disinterested, you can be sure it's a dirty trick, a provocation. The main thing is, avoid general assignment work. Avoid it from the day you arrive. If you land in general assignment work that first day, then you are lost, and this time for keeps. General assignment work? General assignment work. That is the main and basic work performed in any given camp. 80% of the prisoners work at it, and they all die off. All. And then they bring new ones in to take their places. and they again are sent to general assignment work. Doing this work, you would spend the last of your strength, and you were always hungry, always wet, always shoeless, and you were given short rations and short everything else, and put in the worst beds, and they won't give you any treatment when you're ill. The only ones who survive in camps are those who try at any price not to be put in general assignment work from the first day. At any price? At any price. Because now I am president, I assimilated and I accepted this altogether unexaggerated advice of the cruel special assignment prisoner, forgetting only to ask him one thing. How do you measure that price? How high do you go? If you're listening,